Jon Jang. For 4 decades, the trajectory of composer pianist Jon Jang's work mirrors the development of a multiracial, democratic, new American majority from his unique perspective. Inspired by the music from the Black Arts Movement of the 1960s, Jang has collaborated with Max Roach in their work Census, Eleanor Bumpers, and Can't Stop Crying for America, Black Lives Matter, which represents Jang's work in response to the legal lynching of Black Americans. Jang's Reparations Now, Concerto for Large Ensemble and Taiko, pays tribute to the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations, and shouts out a clarion call for reparations for Black Americans. Jang also explores Chinese-American transnational history in works such as the Chinese-American Symphony, a work that pays tribute to the Chinese immigrant laborers who built the first transcontinental railroad in the United States. Jang, a grandson of the Paper Sun, composed Island, Immigrant Suite No. 2, for the Kronos Quartet about the Chinese immigrants who were incarcerated on Angel Island in San Francisco during the Chinese Exclusion Act era. Jang has toured with Max Roach, James Newton, David Murray, Zhiben Chen, and Min Chao Fen in Europe, China, South Africa, Canada, and the United States. The other participant is Lauren Kachikawa, who serves as Associate Professor of Ethnomusicology and Musicology at the George Washington University's Corcoran School of the Arts and Design, and is chair of the music program. His teaching and research explore the intersection of race and music in the 20th and 21st centuries, and he is author of Sounding Race in Rap Songs and The Sound of Struggle, Black Revolutionary Nationalism and Asian American Jazz. And finally, we have Francis Wong, who has been blessed to have an artistic career full of accomplishment and positive notice, including being considered one of the great saxophonists of his generation by the late jazz critic Phil Elwood. His work is well documented on recordings, as he's featured on more than 40 titles as a leader in sidemen. For nearly 4 decades, he has performed his own innovative brand of jazz and creative music for audiences in North America, Asia, and Europe, with such luminaries as Jon Jang, Tatsuo Aoki, Jenny Lin, Mia Masaoka, Vijay Iyer, Jen Shu, William Roper, Bobby Bradford, James Newton, Don Maya, Glenn Horiuchi, John Shikai, Cecil Taylor, Max Rose, and Joseph Jarman. Francis' career as a musician-composer is inextricable from his cultural and collaborative work and activism throughout the United States, particularly the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Lancaster, Pennsylvania. His artistic explorations are rooted, both directly and indirectly, in his work as a mentor for youth and emerging artists, artistic director, community activist, music producer, as co-founder of the artist development organization Asian Improv Arts, and as lecturer on the faculty of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. Please welcome our distinguished panelists.
So yeah, my name is Lauren Kajikawa, and thank you, Kevin, for the introduction. Thanks to Kevin for the invitation to be here, for organizing this wonderful symposium, and thanks to Yolanda for all of your logistical help. It's been really well organized and very user-friendly from my side, so I really appreciate all of that work. I think the plan for today, right, is we have this opportunity to spend time with 2 artists that have really devoted the majority of their lives to the subject of today's conference. And I want to take full advantage of that to allow them an opportunity to share some of their experiences and thoughts and tell their stories, while also leaving room for, I mean, look at who's gathered in this room, right? I have the honor of moderating this panel, but Deborah Wong has written about Jon Jang and Francis Wong at Asian Improv Records. Susan Asai is one of the first authors I read on Asian American jazz. Kevin Fellas has written his own, essay on this topic. So I feel like, how did I get to be the one who's standing here, doing this? But there's been a lot of good things written about the work that Jon and Francis have done, and happy to refer folks who are interested in that bibliography to that work. But I think the thing that we have a chance to do today is really engage the audience as well in sorts of questions that you want to ask. You'll have your chance today, right? And we hope that will help us to actually generate more things that we can put into this archive that we're building on this important historical topic. Of course, it's beyond the scope of any single panel to tell the whole story of Jon and Frances's career or the history of Asian Improv Records. We're not going to do that justice today. But I do want to start with a few words of introduction, including some of my own personal reflections to provide some context for the conversation. And then after that, I'm going to try to be I'll ask a few questions and be involved, but I get to say my piece up front before we get to Jon and Frances. So Asian Improv Records was founded in 1987 in San Francisco, California, by Jon Jang and Frances Wong, and was really originally created to serve the needs, the immediate needs of musicians who were active in the Asian American consciousness movement, long before the internet and social media made self-promotion a lot easier for independent artists. I mean, it's important to realize they did this in an era before all of those tools that artists have at their disposal today to put their music up online and send people a link, right? And they organized this record label as a way of documenting, distributing, and promoting the work, at the beginning mainly of Jon and Glenn Horiyuchi, who's another pianist and composer who passed away at an untimely age from cancer in the year 2000. And their music really reflected the revolutionary politics of the era. They explored this hybrid sound drawing from Black American and Asian diasporic traditions. And in the 1990s and 2000s, the roster of artists that recorded for I'm just going to call it AIR for short, Asian Improv Records, really diversified and expanded. But AIR continued to hold a really important space, I think, in jazz and in creative music for independent artists. Today, in fact, AIR boasts one of the largest archives of work by Asian American musicians, composers, and their collaborators. And we have these two folks here to thank for that. I personally first learned about Jon and Frances over 25 years ago, which is pretty crazy. And at that time, Asian Improv was about 10 years old. That's when I kind of first became aware of them. And I became aware of them because I was taking piano lessons with one of their collaborators, the late Glenn Horiyuchi, who had an artist in residency grant at the Japanese American National Museum in Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. So I signed up for piano lessons, really knowing nothing about Horiyuchi or Jon or Frances. And even though I was from the Japanese American community in Los Angeles, grown up there, all of my family was there. And it's true that studying with Glenn did improve my keyboard skills, but I have to say, more than that, I ended up becoming more interested in his musical career and his life, right? As soon as I found out who is this guy that's recorded these records and made music about the Japanese American experience and done it so powerfully, what is this record label that these vinyl records that I was getting my hands on, where did they come from, and who are these other artists that have recorded for that label? So, to put it simply, like, hearing Glenn's music and learning about other Asian American artists like Jon and Frances, Anthony Brown, Mark Izu, Mia Masaoka, and many others really changed my life, like fundamentally changed my life. And I was deeply inspired by their insistence, these musicians' insistence on being heard on their own terms, right? Insisting on a version of jazz, and by extension, a version of American identity that did not silence or marginalize their lives or their perspectives, right? Unapologetically being themselves through their music. And as I delved deeper, I was an undergraduate student at the time, and as I got deeper into sort of cultural studies and US politics through my undergraduate coursework in ethnic studies, the music of Asian improv artists helped bring to life the issues that scholars that I was reading were talking about. I'm thinking about people like Robin Kelly, George Lipsitz, Lisa Lowe, and others, who wrote about how music not only preserves an alternative or counter-hegemonic history, but also serves as a cultural force that provides people with a real experience of worlds that don't yet exist, right? Of a sense of freedom, or freedom dreams, as Robin Kelly put it, that allows listeners to rehearse identities that aren't yet permissible in the realm of formal politics. And this is the space that these musicians were holding, and that I was able to hear and experience through their music, and it really did bring these concepts to life for me. And I ended up devoting my senior year as an undergraduate to conducting oral history interviews with Asian improv musicians, and built on the work of other scholars that at that time had written about them. And I'm thinking namely of two people who are in this room, Wong and Susan Asai, who had already written scholarly articles about their music, and ended up turning those oral histories into a 120-page undergraduate thesis that helped get me into a PhD program in musicology. So I really feel like I owe this life-changing career path, right, to being able to stand here today and be invited to a panel like this to these musicians. Two main insights that I think I took away and that I've written about that I think are important for our discussion today. One is the relational nature of Asian American identity, right? Asian American identity is not this self-contained thing in a box separate from other identities, but it's one that's constituted in relation to other, in the US, other racialized identities. And in other words, to really understand Asian American music or Asian American jazz, we really have to understand the Asian American relationship to African American, music and musicians. And so that's something that's really fundamental to this story. Another thing is something that I think it was Susan who mentioned it already today, that Asian American jazz is not the expression, right, of something inherent. Like John and Francis don't sound the way they do in their music because they're expressing some Chinese or Asian music essence, but rather it's their creative activity as musicians that has actually created a sense of what Asian American identity can look and sound like, and bring community into existence, right? The idea of who people are as Asian Americans is largely the result of this active creative process. And in short, I really feel like I've learned how to think and write about cultural production through engaging with these people's lives and their music. And for that, I'm forever grateful. So I just want to say thank you to Jon and to Francis and to the Asian improv community for their contributions. Okay, so that's a little bit about who I am, where I come from, and some context to get us started. I'm going to start by asking some questions, and like I said, please do think about your own questions because we're going to save some time to turn it over to you. And also, Jon and Francis, I want you to answer questions, but if you have any, we have a series of slides and music examples that I can also access, so if something comes up, the idea here is that this is a structured improvisation, right? We've got some things planned, but we're going to try to be spontaneous and in the moment. So my first question is, in her book, Speak It Louder, Wong writes that when Asian Americans listen to music, right, they, quote, their act of choice and perception is no solipsistic mirror, but rather a critical moment of representation, end quote. And I've always interpreted this to mean that because there, at least when you were growing up, and even when I was growing up, there's so few Asian musical role models available out there that Asian American identity is largely about choosing from those existing things that we can access, and choosing to identify with that music and use that as a way of kind of creating and inhabiting an identity. So my first question to both of you is, what initially drew you to jazz? Why jazz?
Well, could you put up slide 2 from Sounds of Struggle?
Absolutely. Which one do you want?
And then
I've got this one. What do you think about that?
okay, there's a. Well, you can have
Yeah.
that.
I'll let it slide. Right?
It'll
And then there'll be another one.
Yeah, I got this one too.
So in Professor Kajikawa's essay, The Sound of Struggle, Black Revolution, Nationalism, and Asian American Jazz, he observed that Asian American musicians of this generation were born in the 1950s, in the mid-1950s. Francis, myself, Fred Ho, and Glenn Horiuchi. And so one of the experiences that we shared was that like in the early 70s, like the book, we were exposed to, back to the,
The other one, yeah.
yeah, we were exposed to Black Revolution politics. And in Malcolm X's book, By Any Means Necessary, he recognized the importance of Black music to Black liberation. So Malcolm X, I remember when we were learning about Malcolm X, that we equated Malcolm X with John Coltrane. It's not that we did, but that it seems the black liberation movement did. So now let's look at the slide of black liberation music. And so there were a number of books about black music. It wasn't called jazz. A lot of the black intellectuals and musicians rejected the word jazz. Say such as Max Roach, his memoir, one of the working titles of his memoir was Jazz is a four-letter word. And then Duke Ellington's memoir was Music is my mistress, not jazz is my mistress. So, and a number of these books were written by black writers, and some of them were black women writers. So Hildred Roach, her book, Black American Music, Past, Present, begins with 1619 and ends with 1970. And then there's Eileen Southern's book, Music of Black Americans, History. But Frances and I were also close to Leroy Jones, who, let's see, this book was Blues People, and by the way, this is the 60th anniversary of Blues People, and black music. So there were even white writers that wrote books. Title is Black Talk by Ben Sidran, and let's see, it Black Nationalism and the Revolution by Brad
It's up there, yeah.
Yeah. Oh. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've been nicknamed by a black musician on one stage today as Master Blaster. So let me get it. In fact, actually, why Francis is confused with me is because he has to translate what I'm talking about, so they think he's Jon Jang. So okay, why jazz? Yes, that's the question. Okay, so quite a context. Well, I listened a lot to John Coltrane, the vinyl recordings, but really what was a life-changing moment was when I attended a concert at Keystone Corner, which is the iconic jazz club located in the North Beach area in San Francisco. And it was his Bright Moments concert. And Rahsaan Willa Kirk was a multi-instrumentalist. You would see sometimes he would perform with 3 tenor saxophones at once. And he had incredible wind capacity. He could blow a piece of paper against the wall. And this is not mythic proportions. So he did the Bright Moments concert, and it became a life-changing moment for me. It was in June 1972, and it was right after finals at UC Berkeley. And so after that concert, I quit. I dropped out of UC Berkeley, and music became a crucial part of my life. I wasn't thinking about a career, and so when I dropped out, I informed my mother about it. She was disappointed. See, my father graduated from UC Berkeley, and anyway, and then the pushback I got, like my brother said, not everybody can be Van Cliburn, and I exclaimed, I don't want to be a Van Cliburn, I want to be Jon Jang.
Hear, hear.
And so actually, I studied for 1.5 years. I started late at piano at age 19. And after a 1.5 years, I auditioned schools in New York and the Oberlin Conservatory of Music. I got accepted to all of them. And I chose the Oberlin Conservatory of Music because part of it was the architecture. The other part was that, because it had a Never Never Land quality about it, like Disneyland. It had this Gothic architecture, the King building at Conservatory, which is Yamasaki, and then there's of course the Student Center, which was built by missionaries. So, and also the Oberlin fostered free thinking. And so it was taboo. Okay, so I was accepted as a piano performance major, meaning I'm committed to the performance practice of 18th and 19th century Western European classical music. But I rejected that. I didn't want to limit myself to that, so I studied composition. I was the only Asian American in a jazz ensemble. I was the only non-white student in the Javanese gamelan ensemble. I was the only non-white student in the West African Corps ensemble. And then I was the only conservatory composer to collaborate with modern dance. And anyway, that's it.
Yeah.
Maybe I should.
You want to take a breath?
Yeah. see, I'm the air mouth. He's the air head. That's how you can tell the difference.
If you, Francis, we definitely want to hear your why jazz story, but I'll just say if you want to know what Jon thought about these issues that he just said, all you have to do is look at his first self-titled album, Jang from 1982. The hands at the piano keyboard with the illustration of the handcuffs there, and you can't see it in this photo, but if you look really closely at the album imagery, the handcuffs, written on the handcuffs, it says U.S. Music Institutions. And then he's standing in front of a protest sign that says, monk yes, Mozart no. So, Francis, how did you get into jazz?
So I've been working on a memoir project, and so I think it's kind of like a stand-up. And so I think that was really great, Jon, because it's just, you showed rather than you told.
Oh, yes.
So, how many of you guys know Abby Lincoln, the music of Abby Lincoln? Not everybody, right? And she has this song called You Gotta Pay the Band. Mm-hmm. You guys know that one? There's the whole record, right? Is named that. So, oh, it really isn't easy just to let the good times roll. Everything is measured at a cost. Everybody living pays their share of dues. But when the party's over and the revelry is done, you gotta pay the band that played your song. So that's excerpted from You Gotta Pay the Band, lyrics by Abby Lincoln, recorded and released 1991. So this song by Abby, speaks to me so much. And as with a lot of her songs, there are profound messages in the piece. You Gotta Pay the Band not only has a broader meaning that one needs to take responsibility for one's life, to own it. It has a particular meaning for musicians and other artists trying to sustain themselves and their work. For me as a composer, band leader, and producer of projects, this has meant paying attention to where our support comes from, as well as my own responsibilities to provide support. So, although I had played gigs when I was growing up as a teenage violinist, sounds like that werewolf movie. But anyway, I think my professional career began this one time at Stanford that Jon Jang and this one invited me to play. By then I was trying to play the saxophone, okay? And so with him at, there's this place called the People's Tea House. So it was a student-run little food gap. This is way before, they brought, all these food opportunities on campus. So the students, especially Asian American students, this was at the time, we were only less than 5% of the student body, and the food was terrible. So we, the students, Asian American students, we formed our own business, just like we did in America, right? And created this thing called the People's Tea House because we were influenced by China at that point. And so we just put peoples on everything. That was our branding strategy, So yeah, People's Tea House. We even had this party called the People's Disco. And so, okay, back to the story. So the tea house served ramen, bao, shumai, almond cookies, arare, and tea, and stayed open till midnight. So, student hours, right? The proceeds went to community organizations that the tea house volunteers would pick. So, we would support Chinatown organizations or J-Town organizations with the money that was made from the students coming in for their bao, And so it was part of a really amazing community building process going on among Asian American students on campus during the early days of the movement. So this is really what a lot of the soul and heart and soul the Asian American movement was about, you know. And so there was a poster that said, "Food for the people, food for the soul, funds for the community." So this is 1970, no, this is, what was that? What year was that? 1981, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so there happened to be an upright piano in the space, and they would sometimes have music in there, even a band called Jazz Min. You know, Min, the Chinese character for people, right? And they even paid the musicians. So sometimes in the community we have a hard time getting paid, right? So one night John was invited to play, and he said, "Come to me, come play." I had just started playing, but John kind of took a chance on me, and this is really a lot of the reason why I was able to be in jazz. So amid the bank of steamers with chashubao and shumai and hot plates and rows of ramen steeping in bowls of boiled water providing quite the fragrant ambience, John and I went through a program of standards. Of course, if you consider Ornette Coleman's Broken Shadows of standards. If you steam some frozen bao, cook a package of ramen, and put on maybe John's self-portrait recording, you'll be there. In any case, we were well received. It was nice. Another special night at the People's Tea House. When the night was over, John handed me $25. So this is 1981, so it's okay. And I said, "Huh?" And I just figured here was Jon Jang, the conservatory graduate, which he talked about, and already a gigging musician, and I was just kind of a beginner. But in his grand generosity that I've known for 40 years, John says, "You're a musician, you get paid." It was a transformative moment. And so it was. John would school me on getting gigs and how to show appreciation to one's fellow musicians. Fundamental to the ethic was promoting how we are in this together. Also critical was passing on the knowledge so we could all contribute to us all getting work by learning how to effectively lead bands. In this way, we created an economy of sorts. But back to Abby's song. Beyond the very important idea that we need to be supported for our work, I also take away that it's a way to think about mutual accountability between communities and artists. And essentially, this has been the way I and the crew at Asian Improv pursue support for our work. We are committed to making our work because we understand that there are those out there in the community, in our Asian American communities and beyond, that believe and are ready to step up in meaningful ways that you've got to pay the band. So somehow that was about how I got into jazz.
I love it. Actually, following up on that, I think this question is really related to the theme of what you just read to us. Holding space, Francis. That's in a lot of our past conversations, you've used that phrase to talk about the work that you do, not just as a musician. You have used it to describe, holding space, that John's music and his musical activities hold space, but also as a cultural activist and sort of Asian Improv Records as a holding space project. And could you speak a little about what do you mean by that, and maybe what are some examples of that from you and then from John?
Well, one of the reasons why we formed Asian Improv is because we didn't see ourselves in the music as leaders. There were several, of course, before us who played in different bands, Louis Armstrong, whatever. But the idea of that we could be leaders, we could be composers, and that we would give people the chance, artists the chance to make a record with their name on it, with the music that they want to record. And so that was really essentially what the project was about, was having a label that independent artists, Asian American artists in particular, could come to us and say, "I want to put out this record, I want it to be about this, I want it to be about who I am, and I want to, I want to show what we can do, and I'd like to add it to the catalog. And so, in some ways, the catalog, so John's record, The Ballad of the Bullet, was 00001. That's the first record. And then I think we're up to 117 titles. And so the idea is like the catalog in some ways can be seen as a metaphor, and it was great what people talked about the archive earlier. It's the catalog is a space in which all our work can be put up there next to each other, and not just the people who are released on our label, but it creates this space in the economy or in the social space that Asian Americans can lead bands, can write music, can also take political stands. And of course, the first record was prophetic because it was a dedication to Thelonious Monk and Malcolm X. And so the idea that Asian Americans could take that space of solidarity, could take that space of creativity, and could take that space of wanting a new society, that we're saying, hey, come on along, get into it, So that's kind of, I think, the basic idea. And then we've kind of gone on, so it's not just about making a record, we're doing a lot of things like, producing concerts, doing different projects, and in the community, we do a lot of arts education now. So it's about kind of creating that space where people can feel particularly Asian Americans can feel comfortable and confident that their own creativity can be expressed, and that it will be part of the change that the society needs.
And some of our shared values and shared practices, well, for one of the things that I've tried to support on every recording is to have a composition by a member of our group. And it's been pretty consistent since after my first album, Jang, where I recorded works by Olivier Messiaen and my mentor, Dr. Wendell Logan, professor of Afro-American Music Department at Oberlin. And that's the democratic nature of this music making. It's one of the lessons that was taught to me by Max Roach. And so, yeah, it's in our ensembles, we treat each other with respect. So the black musicians and the Asian American musicians who are Korean and other musicians of color, it's this kind of give and take, and we don't treat each other or the musician, or if you're a leader, we don't treat the musicians as the hired help. And so we're creating a community, music communities, and this kind of also self-care, collective self-care, and we want to make sort of this meaningful space that's both spiritual, emotional, physical, and intellectual. And actually, I'm not sure if this is the other question, but Francis, you mentioned this, is about embracing difference. That's why we're calling We All Don't Sound Alike. And because we want to say we all don't sound alike. I am not Francis Wong.
I am not Jon Jang.
Yeah, so we reference books, and this is probably your other question about anti-essentialism,
Yeah.
and so the lessons we've learned from like Ron Takaki's Strangers from a Different Shore, where Asian Americans, it's not just being but becoming, and or like Lisa Lowe's, and so it's not essentialist, or Lisa Lowe's Immigrant Acts. She has a chapter called heterogeneity, hybridity, multiplicity, Asian American difference. And so she states that the practice of Asian American culture includes, inheriting the tradition, modifying the tradition, and inventing or reinventing the tradition. What are Did I leave anything out?
We'll leave it up to Lauren to.
Oh, wait, so our mission statement is, new directions in music by Asian Americans. That was
the first mission statement.
Yeah, so we don't tell artists what kind of music they should play or who they should work with. So I'll just say that I was a judge for an Asian talent show, and the organizers told this Asian American woman, she has a jazz trio, you got to have Asian American musicians. She had white musicians as a rhythm section, and so she was dismissed. See, that kind of thinking is just how you describe it? Ignorant.
Wrong?
Wrong.
Yes.
Wrong? Wrong? Okay.
We're not going to go there.
I know, it's Asian improv is for improvisation, not comedy.
That question has been, that confusion has happened, right? Let me ask a sort of different question that maybe will lead us to taking a look or listen at some music examples. I don't know how many of you might have seen this, but in an article in Pitchfork magazine last year, a journalist by the name of Kat Zhang wrote an article about Asian American music, and she asked, one of the issues that she raised was that to her, the idea of Asian American has become somewhat diffuse and depoliticized in the last couple of decades. And she actually cited the work of Jon and Francis and other Asian improv artists as an example of how different the idea of Asian American music was in the 1970s and 1980s from how it is today. And so kind of one question I have here, and I think there's some truth to that. I'm just looking at one of the slides that we prepared. These are the first 3 artists that recorded for Asian Improv, right? Jon Jang, Francis Wong, 4. Jon Jang, Francis Wong, Fred Ho, and Glenn Horiuchi, who recorded who did their first recordings when they were in their mid-20s. They were all members of a political organization, the League of Revolutionary Struggle, which you guys might want to talk about. And so yeah, the question is, do you kind of agree with what Kat Zhang is saying? Has the term become depoliticized in your opinion? And how how has the Asian American in Asian American jazz changed since you guys got started?
Well, now is the time. I think we got to play some music, right?
Okay.
So
the
first recording, which is my recording, The Ballad of the Bullet, Francis Wong contributed his first recorded composition. And it was kind of like a Black Lives Matter piece before the term Black Lives Matter was invented. This was, why don't you talk about Melvin Trust?
Sure. So back in the 80s, I was involved, and my wife is back there, Yumi Hata. We were involved in the Jesse Jackson for President campaigns in 1984 and 1988. But what people don't remember is that in all our local areas, we formed these things called the Rainbow Coalition. And so in San Jose, there was a 17-year-old black man, Melvin Truss, was killed by a police officer. And at that time, the black community was very isolated and was reaching out for support, and reached out to the Rainbow and other different communities. And as I was involved in the student movement at the time, and part of raising money for the family for Melvin Truss's family for justice in this case was to write a piece of music called Prayer for Melvin Truss. And so that was my first recorded composition, because John later put it on The Ballad of the Bullet.
The version that I actually have is from a more recent recording by John that also features you.
Oh yeah, this is the reboot.
This is the reboot. So from 2019, but originally composed in 1987. I'm going to go ahead and play about a minute or so.
really special about being able to come back because this was recorded on Air 0001, and then this was released on Air 0101. So this was for our 101st recording. So to return to this composition, and also to have Hitomi Oba and Nick DePina, younger Asian American musicians, to be part of it and part of this continuing development of our music.
And they were born when Asian Improv was born.
Yeah.
So that's. So another sort of Black Lives Matter work that I composed was called Eleanor Bumpers. In 1985, I performed in New York at, I think it was the first Asian American Jazz Festival in New York, in Fred Ho's Afro Asian Ensemble, and I also performed in a trio. And a friend of mine who was involved in the Justice for Eleanor Bumpers campaign invited me to an event which was held at the school. Well, we found out at the last minute that the city mysteriously blocked that event from happening. And so a black minister opened his church, and when you hear the piece, it's really about the beauty. It's about overcoming odds. Like for example, Lift Every Voice and Sing, composed by James Weldon Johnson and J. Rosamond Johnson. That was composed during a time when the system of white supremacy imposed Jim Crow laws, and not only that lynching was on the rise, but was made into a public outdoor social activity where white families would get together for a picnic, while watching and enjoying as entertainment a black man being tortured and lynched. And in Florida, between 1900, which was the birth of Lift Every Voice and Sing, to 1932, Florida had the highest number of lynchings per capita in the United States. So Eleanor Bumpers, this featured David Murray on tenor saxophone. It's really about the beauty, about the lily that can endure in the swamp. Oh, so did I put the cue?
I got it. But do you want, from where, sorry, is there a cue, or do you want to start from the beginning? John? Well, do you want to start from the beginning, or where do you want to
No,
start?
what the cue is, yes. Like it's 1 minute, I think.
I'm going to do my best here, because there's no, oh yeah, okay.
This is more about the beauty of the black church that commemorated the 1-year death of Eleanor Bumpers. Eleanor Bumpers was a 66-year-old grandmother who was shot by the Bronx police for not paying her rent on time. And so you see Francis, his is somber. This is more about expressing the beauty of the black church. And this third and more recent example, why did they have to shoot him so many times for Mario Woods? First was a piece that's going to focus on Mario Woods, who was a 26-year-old black man who was suspected of knife stabbing, and 4 San Francisco police officers shot and executed Mario Woods. They shot him 20 times, 6 bullets in the back, and they were not punished. So, and this was during the Black Lives Movement, and Amanda Kemp is a black woman, spoken word artist. She and I were getting kind of depressed with all these killings. And so the piece turned into kind of a meditation. Didn't I have it like, was it what, 040 to, yeah, I think it was 040 seconds.
Philando Castile. Samuel Dubose. Freddie Gray. Akai Gurley. Tamir Rice. Walter L. Scott. Sandra Bland. Mario Woods.
Thanks you guys for sharing those music examples with us. And I, just, one observation here.
Oh, wait, let me ask you,
Okay.
does anybody remember Akai Gurley? Okay, so for your students, Akai Gurley was a young black man who was shot by a Chinese American police officer. He was suspected of having a knife, and he didn't have a knife. And so, so there was this uproar from like the new Chinese American right, who wanted to punish Peter Leong, the police officer, with just community service. And because they saw equality as, if white police officers can get away with killing a black man, then Chinese Americans should have equal rights. So anyway, I don't want to get into the dynamics of it, but
no, I think we should get them. Why not? I mean, to me, that story. Thank you, John. That story really does underscore, a point that I hear in your work and that you've talked about in terms of, this isn't just about. This isn't, your music and your work is not just about these issues, but it's about partnering with people in showing solidarity in their struggles, right? And that Asian, one of the things I hear in sort of your version of Asian American music or Asian American jazz is that it's not only about, highlighting the stories of Asian Americans, right? But about who are the communities that we are in relation to, that we are standing in solidarity with. And like you said, is freedom about the freedom to be exonerated the same way that white police officers are? Is that what we want, right? Or is what we're thinking about a different kind of freedom that includes justice for people like Mario Woods, or and I think not only is that just topical in your music, but you have consistently, both of you throughout your careers, have collaborated with artists from a variety of backgrounds. Asian Improv has never been an Asian-only affair, and I think that's something that is important to acknowledge, especially at a conference that has Asian American in the title. To continue this, what are some, one of the things I hear you saying is that in some ways things haven't changed for you, at least personally, in terms of what you feel like your mission is as a musician. But you've also lived through and had your careers unfold in a time in which, when you started, there was very little public, maybe infrastructure around supporting Asian American arts, right? That's something that you organized for and helped bring into existence. And increasingly it's more, throughout the 80s and 90s, different funding agencies created funding categories to support, work by diverse artists, right, for lack of a better word. And I think it might be interesting for this audience to hear a little bit about some of those struggles of overrepresentation and the way that, people may have tried to use or even abuse, in some cases, those kinds of opportunities, and how you personally, or maybe Asian Improv as an organization, has been involved in some of those struggles over representation.
Well, I think it goes back to the beginning. It's like when we started Asian Improv, it was at a time when the term was in crisis I think it's in like middle 80s, I guess, and there was a kind of because there was a coming of age of all the different immigrant groups from Southeast Asia, South Asia, and so the idea of a umbrella Asian American term was being questioned, and so part of what we needed to do was to kind of look at the creative process of the artists that we were working with to be the process of becoming, who we are. So what that meant is that we don't define who to play with, what the music's supposed to sound like, what the title. I think it was a form of curation that would allow for the artists to seek their own path. And I think that I believe that was what we were trying to do when we started the Asian American movement, was this idea that as Asian in America, we want to pursue our own path for realization. And for us as Asian Improv was to see, what are the artists going to come up with, and to use the mutual support that we wanted to encourage as a way to, we could support each other to be ourselves. And I think that in some ways that's how we kind of make it possible, is that it's like the traditions, the Asian American traditions that we are part of and that we advance. So that in that same sense, we as Asian Americans, we don't act all alike, we don't sound all alike, and we don't think all alike. And so that actually allows for traditions and lineages of a certain ethics, values, and ways of being to come forward, as opposed to it being essentialized by a notion, by an administrative label. So I think that's kind of the way we approach it. And so that allowed for us to change, from period to period, because there's been so much change in the politics of this country between, when we started in the 80s and now. Things changed major, like the Vincent Chin period. There was then post 9/11, George Floyd, the pandemic, So I think some of these basic values of allowing ourselves to realize ourselves has been consistent.
This might be a good time to throw it open and take some questions from the audience. I mean, I could monopolize the conversation, but I feel like, I was just thinking like when I spend a lot of time in the classroom, and after I play music and people are listening or whatever, I always want to know what do people think, what are your reactions, what are your questions. So something from the audience maybe? What do you want to ask John and Francis?
I wonder if we should play some more music, because you only covered like the Black Lives.
Okay, what do you want? We'll play some more music and people can think in this, and while they're playing the music, listen to the music and think about questions. Yeah.
Like something contrary, but also from the 1980, like Tiananmen.
Okay.
Yeah.
I feel like we're on NPR, we're gonna have a little music break.
Well, I think Tiananmen, the massacre, is not what we call a break. It's the opposite of that. I mean, I don't even want to laugh about it, but
Okay. Here we go. Oops, sorry.
okay. So, how many of you remember the Tiananmen massacre on June 4th, 1989? You rated higher? Okay, so we have people that may not remember because they're maybe born in 1989. Why don't you enlighten the young people, any one of you? Anybody that's not a participant? Okay, that didn't work.
Actually, I have a comment. I have a comment. So, I think that relates to some of what we were just talking about, because for a lot of us who were in the Asian American movement, the Tiananmen Square incident was very troubling and really kind of rocked our world in terms of like our assumptions, because we had wanted China to be the good guy in the world, and we were disappointed there. And so we had to kind of, as Chinese Americans in particular, we had to kind of look at, oh, things have gotten a lot more complicated than we wanted them to be, and that we were actually facing a greater complexity. And so that the idea of being an Asian American or Chinese American was becoming more complicated. And I actually feel like that's what we were saying in the music, you know, in terms of conflicting anthems and certain amount of, well, we were scrambling some eggs there, right?
Well, it's also a, kind of a musical portrait of what was going on at Tiananmen Square, the chaos and unsettling. And there's a quote, a reference to the Chinese national anthem, Qilai. Da, 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 da. So it's kind of like, to me, the deterioration of Chinese patriotism. And then there's the Shui Ran Di Fang Zai, which is the anthem, da, 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 da. That is something, a song that was shared by both the youth and the Chinese Communist Party, because it was about, well, it was about the Vietnam-China border war in 1984, which China lost. And so, even though they shared that song, it was, to me, yeah, deterioration of patriotism. Because the students, the pro-democracy students, just, you know, wanted to address these questions of democracy. And yeah, I mean, like you said, it's complicated. I mean, Mao Zedong was embraced by the Black Panthers. You know, Black Panthers from Oakland, they would sell Mao's Red Book at Sadler Gate and UC Berkeley. But then you look at, I mean, I look at that history like the Tibet, you know. I mean, China, after they founded the Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party, they invaded Tibet and then committed cultural genocide. I mean, they forced them to speak Mandarin and not their own language. They burned down monasteries. They imprisoned monks. And in fact, yeah, Dalai Lama was in exile. So yeah, it was very complicated period. And yeah, I used to go to this restaurant called a Fanti restaurant, which is a Chinese Muslim restaurant, and the people are really warm. They're the Uyghur people from the Xinjiang province. And we had song and dance, and they were warm, and the food was great. And then in 2014, I brought a friend, and they were gone. And it was replaced by kind of, I would describe as Beijing yuppies. They were kind of soulless. The food was terrible, and so it's just, I don't know if it really has to do with anything, but I was pretty disappointed.
Did you write a song about it?
No.
Sorry, we don't have a music example of that.
Well, I just think that, you know, just speaking very honestly, as people who, you know, both of us have been involved in political movements for quite a long time, you know, this was at the beginning of a very challenging time in terms of figuring out who we were and how we were going to go forward, you know, and not just about, you know, the idealism of our youth, but being able to stick to our principles, but face the complexity that the future was holding for us.
Yeah, I put up this one slide. It's actually, it looks like there's an online question, and then there's also, Tony, you had your hand up, and I also want to put up this slide, which when the question goes away, it kind of illustrates some of the titles before Tiananmen and some of the titles after, right, which I think speaks somewhat to actually the answer to the challenge, right? You faced with a challenge, you could have hung it up right there and said, well, that was a good ride, we're done, walking away from it, but you continued to find meaning and purpose in your music and in your organizing, and so let's see, Tony, wanna? Yeah. I think we have a microphone so that the online folks can hear you. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Kachikawa asked us to think of a question while we were listening to the last example, so I tried. I tried to conform to that request.
Remember, education is about compliance.
And this, you'll be the judge, but this question will either be interesting or just strange. You both have spoken a bit about how over the decades you have intentionally or allowed it to happen that you would collaborate with musicians from different backgrounds. You encourage that. When I think of your music, I think about especially the most charged political recordings that you've recorded, and that charge can either be mournful or that charge can be angry. So without naming names, if you can think about all the recording sessions that you've done over the years of music that you consider politically charged in its expression, could you hear differences, different degrees of engagement with the players with that political attitude? Or do you feel like somehow the music brought everyone to sort of the same level of political expressive intensity? Can you think of gigs where some people in the band were not as committed to what you were laying out in your musical expression without having to name any names? Weird or interesting?
Well, I think it brings up.
Oh, no, I'll have another question after you answer.
Well, I think that brings up this question that gets asked us all the time, is whether we think we have political music. And actually, Kat, who wrote that article in Pitchfork, she was really fascinated with her answer because we said we didn't think our music was political. And because that's not what we're engaged in. And I guess, and more recently there's this film that Vijay is in called
Vijay Iyer.
Yeah, a mixtape thing, and he talks about the political work that music does. So the idea is that we make music, we make all different kinds of music, and we're not tactical in the sense that we say certain music is political and other music's not political, because our reality, and I think the fact that we are still the same as what Fritz was talking about, racialized labor. That the music, that we are just trying to realize different music in different moments, and part of making music is being in that moment, and not to be too heady about the intent and all that. So if the moment's political, then yeah, it strikes. Just like at different times when like an example would be, we used to play this song, this Chilean anthem called
El pueblo unido, más vencido.
Yeah, the people united will never be defeated. And so we're playing at this Jesse Jackson thing, and we're playing, and then we get to that part of the song where it's the chant, the people united will never be defeated. And then Jesse Jackson just starts walking in the door, and so it was just this kind of, so the moments lined up there, but in general, as musicians, we don't, I think that we're not necessarily around saying that our music is political, although our reality is political. If that's kind of maybe a little bit too nuanced, but that is the way we think about it.
Well, it's like we both reject Descartes. I think, therefore I am. It's like from what's that opening scene in Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon, where he's mentoring a student, and he says, "So how'd you feel?" And the student responded, "Let me think." And he slaps my hand. "Don't think." And so in that case, I would like to illustrate that feeling with Two Flowers on a Stem.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Which is the last minute, 4:22. No, 3:12 to 4:12. I think that's what it is. Thank you. So the story behind Two Flowers on the Stem is, this is one of the themes that I wrote, commissioned by the Berkeley Repertory Theater in their dramatic adaptation of Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman of Water. And when it was staged at Center Theater Group, which is like Mark Taper. Yeah, I don't know if you ever heard of that, but my father's best friend, who I hadn't seen in years, we had dinner together, and then he told me the story about my father. So I should actually give you some background. My father, Dr. James J. Jang, died with 127 passengers and crew in a 2 commercial airplane collision over the Grand Canyon. And so my family and my family's friend tried to hold a funeral service at Glendale Cemetery, but they refused to hold a service because it's Chinese. And there was no body because his body was burned to ashes. And I later found out that Glendale was a sundown town. Does anybody know what a sundown town is? Oh, good. Then we could have audience participation. This democracy. Well, let's put it this way. This may not be the definition, but if you're a person of color, you could pass by there. You could stop by there. But if you stay overnight, something bad might happen to you. You might get harassed, you might get beaten up, or worse, you get killed. That's not actually the definition, but I thought I'd kind of put it in a more colorful way. So my mother had to raise 3 of us on her own. Actually, my sister was born 8.5 months after my father was killed. And so to me, it was like my mother, the feeling I got, not the thinking, was that it was about the lily that it can endure in the swamp. So I don't know if that's political, but I wasn't thinking whether it's political or non-political. It's just that. See, when we compose, I even compose in the shower. I let the water beat meaningfully against my body. I let the music come to me or through me. You know, I used to play in a black church at Oberlin, and it's just, it's a rich. I don't know how I can explain it. The minister was about to retire, and we held hands and we sang "Take My Hand, Precious Lord" by Thomas A. Dorsey, the father of gospel music. So anyway,
Yeah. You actually both anticipated my question somewhat, because I was going to ask about the aesthetics, right, and not just the politics, and maybe they're interweaved, right, and you guys can speak to that. And I was actually thinking of 2 flowers in a stem, so I guess we're all kind of syncing up here. But the thing I wanted to ask was about the aesthetics, and I wanted to ask about the use of, or collaborating with people who are, sort of play instrumentation from China or Japan, right? People working on use the pipa or urhu or shakuhachi or what have you, right? And how that came about, one, and what sort of inspired you to do that, and what you think you're attempting to do with those kind of collaborations, what do you think actually happened, and we're sort of thinking about the collaboration with Asian heritage instruments in a sense, right? And what kind of part that plays in the music as well.
Yeah, that is something we haven't touched on, but we've heard it in the examples that have been played.
how about Island?
I can play another example, but Kevin asked you, how did that come about? And what gave you the idea to, I mean, we should definitely listen to the music, but I want to push you guys to answer the question. It's my job.
Yeah.
Well, there was a lot going on in the 90s.
Well,
Yeah.
Francis, do you want me to put this up?
well, I could start there.
Okay.
Yeah.
You told me that story. This is actually one of my slides, because it's a story that Francis has told me.
Is that the one about Doug Chan?
I don't know.
Nothing bad.
No, I think this is the idea that the genesis of Asian American
Okay,
jazz.
yeah, so when I was a freshman in college, first year, I guess, there was a guy on the first floor. His name was Doug Chan. He's, and we're friends. And he actually he's distant.
Cousin.
He's your
Yeah,
cousin,
cousin,
right?
yeah.
We may not sound alike, but we're all related. Sorry, couldn't resist. But so Doug played the tenor played saxophone because it was my first day at school, and I really didn't know what to expect. And here's this guy playing Confirmation, this Charlie Parker composition, on the first floor. He says, "Wow, you know, okay, I'm kind of in the right place here." And so, so the thing with the idea is that we're just in a community together. So one of the things that we had to struggle with in forming the Asian American movement was to think about how ABCs and immigrants could build community together. Because in the middle 70s, it was some hard going in Chinatown, you know, between American-born and foreign-born folks. And it was being battled out on the streets, you know.
And Chan is missing, right? The Wing Wang film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the idea as ABCs coming into the movement, part of it was when we were being asked to say, okay, how do we build community together? And some of the most actually rewarding in some ways, joyous moments was our ability to have musicians who came from China play their music, and we got together and played our music together, and we could make a common expression, a community expression. Because what we can represent on the bandstand is actually the diversity that exists in our community. And so it takes some work, but I think that's where, starting from the idea that there's no judgment about, because part of what we have to achieve in our musical culture in this society is to say, oh, this music can't be with that music. You know, this music isn't important, so we don't have to deal with that. But I think part of the idea is that when we play music in Chinatown, we're all there and we're trying to make a community together, and we try as much as we can to have the instruments playing together. You know, so oftentimes, you know, we'll have so there's these stories of Ornette going into Chinatown and playing with the opera, the Cantonese opera folks and stuff. So, you know, we try to play that out in today's by you know, playing our music together, let's say with lion dance or dragon dance. And so, but figuring out our skill in terms of how to make music, how to realize the vision by having the instruments play together. Maybe that Miyoshi
Okay.
might be.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just, I want to add one thing. 'Cause
Oh,
this came
that's, I
out,
forgot about this
no,
one.
right, because like in the 60s and 70s, like African-American musicians were interested in Asia, right? I mean, John Coltrane was interested in Indian music and other, you know, like Alice Coltrane was interested, you know, ended up devoting her life really to that music and spiritual practice. And then Francis, you specifically mentioned this album when we talked many years ago, like seeing McCoy Tyner holding a koto, you know, and actually playing it on this album. He actually improvises on it.
Yeah, that gets back to the story. Because when
Yeah.
we were talking, Doug and I were talking in the middle 70s, is what would Asian American music sound like? And so we thought, oh, maybe some of the things that McCoy's doing would be what, and then 1974 was this record. So, you know.
Yeah, there it was. Do you want me to play?
Whether we have some more
Oh,
questions?
yeah, question. Yeah, I think you should hear the audience.
Actually, I remember back in, oh, sorry.
Hey, I just want to say first of all, thank you for doing what you do. It's, you know, you may not get a lot of feedback from it, but there's a whole bunch of Asian jazz musicians that look at what you've done and say, hey, you know, if they're still grinding, we can still grind and do this. So I want you to understand that. And it got me very curious, this idea of the audience you look to reach. You know, one of my struggles, and I know Peter and I have talked about this a lot, is, you know, when I play jazz, no one in the audience looks like me. You know, I often joke, I'm an Asian guy teaching black music to white people. Right? And the funny thing is that gets a laugh, but that's just the truth. Right? It's like it's my everyday truth. And I'm curious, and even if you even look at who's here for this Asian American jazz, you know, like what percentage is actually Asian American that's interested in this as more than just a distant subject. So when you make records as Asian Improv, I was just curious, I know you probably weren't thinking about this back in '87, but is there a target audience that you are hoping to reach, or you hoped to reach? And on the flip side of that, what is it you hope that the audience that does hear your music takes from it?
You want to answer, or you want me to respond? Well, we could both
Well,
say something.
you know, we all don't sound alike. We all don't think alike. This is a question to pose. Do you play for white audiences or Asian American audiences? And there's like, we perform for whoever comes, but I will give you a story about that. I performed in Johannesburg, South Africa in September 1994, which was 4 months after the election to end apartheid. And at my concert, there was, you know, it was predominantly black, of course, a few whites, but the Chinese community came up. And first time they would attend a festival just because I was there. But, and then I would say like, in the 90s I performed at Cal Performances, which was a 2,200 audience space. And it was, let's see, Ella Bath, she was one of the directors, said that it was like a rainbow audience, which had predominantly Asian American, African American, white, and then to a lesser extent there were some Latinos. But that was the 1990s. That's when there was a whole exploration of multiculturalism, which Francis and I fought for cultural equity, which is to address the needs of specific artists of color, their needs. Whereas, see, in the 80s and 90s there was this trend for arts organizations to be measured. They had to take a litmus test to be measured by how multicultural you were. So the symphony would have board members of color, or they give out free tickets. But for us, the smaller organizations or the artists of color, ours was more, say, meaningful is a word, but we actually worked within the community. We didn't give out free tickets, or maybe we did to people, but it was really a real collaboration. So it's the way our shared values and practice were different than the mainstream. And actually, Lauren, one of your early questions about the funding, yeah, that period was, I would describe it as a multicultural arts wars between the artists of color and the major organizations. Yeah, I would be recorded, maybe I should be saying this.
You're fired.
I know. No, I'm thinking too much. No, I'm acting. That's a problem.
Yeah, well, I'll just continue with what you're saying. So we didn't have a target audience other than the artists themselves, because we want the artists to make the work that they believe in. And we will find the people based on the good work being made. And we need to create the venue. Because I think a lot of the problem with audience is the problem of venue. You know? And so if we're locked out of the venue, our people are locked out of the venues, then they're not going to be there, and for one reason or the other. So that's why a lot of John, myself, and a lot of the artists with Asian Improv, we look at community practice as a way to, that's how we organize things like the Chinatown Music Festival in Chinatown. Just go right to where the people are, and we do our thing, and then also engage with the community, because it's not just about us or jazz, because, like, for example, some of the things that works better is not just about jazz, but a certain way of curating different forms of music and putting things and presenting them in a way, because, like, for example, I teach a class called Musical Communities, Asian American Musical Communities at SF State, and basically I start out by asking the students to tell me what songs they like. you know, and then I bring in the things that I like, you know, and then so it's more of a community building kind of approach as opposed to a marketing kind of thing. You know. So that's generally the way we've approached it, and that way the artists find their audience as opposed to we're, you know, necessarily saying, well, this is the demographic or whatever. And one of the reasons why we're still around is because we don't target the audience. We, in the sense that we leave it up to the artists to make the work, and we go out and figure out how to raise the money to pay for it, which is actually the way everything works in this economy. You know, it's just that it's important for us not to put the pressure on ourselves that actually the economy itself doesn't put its pressure on, you know. So that's my answer.
There are a number of hands up. There's also, I think there was a question online, which to anybody that's taking the time, just shout out to anybody in the internet world who is tuning in. There was a question that I think it was quoting Deborah's work. Oh, here we go. The one at the top there, right? In Deb Wong's book, Speak It Louder, she writes, it's moving, wow. The risk of re-inscription, appropriation, or Orientalist misreading is ever present in Asian American performance. The possibility of empowerment stands side by side with the susceptible audience that consumes with the greedy expectation of Orientalist pleasure and is inevitably gratified. So I kind of hear this, like this quote is about walking the line between, you know, like the way that, you know, well, even in jazz and certainly in classical music, there are a lot of kind of Orientalist tropes, right? These kind of Asian-y sounding things that sound exotic or whatever that audiences will come to expect or take pleasure in. And in aesthetically, as Kevin was saying, like in embracing traditional Asian instruments and melodies, how do you walk that line between sort of Orientalism and, you know, kind of your artistic vision?
It's kind of a work in progress, you know, because well, the way we look at things is we're trying to build community. So we're looking for how we can do that, you know, and a community that we can be a part of with our own integrity. And so what is involved then is we're trying to be accountable, you know, to things. And that's one of the main ways we avoid insulting people.
Accountability, how would you define accountability in your musical activities?
Okay, so we go out on Waverly and we have a presentation with the band. Waverly's in the alleyway in Chinatown. And we play our music, and for the most part, we've gotten good response, you know. And if people complain about it, we hear it. But, you know, it's more part of just the living relationship building. And so, and I think we don't necessarily want the relationship with the people who want the Orientalist tropes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll give an example is that when we performed Tiananmen at Portsmouth Square, which is like the center of Chinatown, where, you know, Chinese immigrants, if they live in SRO, they live in, like, they only have 2 rooms and a community kitchen. That's like their living room. Portsmouth Square is like that. You have elderly Chinese playing Chinese chess. You have women they're talking and socializing. Children are playing on the playground. And so when we brought my ensemble, the Pan-Asian Orchestra, to perform Tiananmen, the first movement is informed by Cantonese opera. Because I attended Cantonese opera concerts on like a 5-star theater on Jackson Street. And one of the important things about Cantonese opera, they would begin with percussion. And so the first movement is informed by the unison melodies, even though it's played by Western instruments as well as the Chinese sonata. They're playing in unison, and then you have all this percussion. The Chinese elderly were playing chess, and all of a sudden they started standing up and started selling my tape cassette recordings of Never Give Up or something like that. And then we performed Ali Shan, which is a Taiwanese, popular Taiwanese song, and they recognized it and they started singing with it. So I think that's the impact that we have is something that's familiar, but it's, I mean, to me, Oriental is that da 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 da, you know, that or if you just use the instrument as a prop, you know, you're not really respecting the instrument. But in our collaborations, and I saw a great piece that Francis did with collaborations with Vietnamese musicians. It's the same practice that we honor and respect our musicians and the music.
Questions? Yes, you.
What's the rule about answering questions? I'm the one with a microphone. Should we line up? Should I stand up? Yeah.
Whatever you feel comfortable doing.
Okay, I'll stand up. Just to show there's one more Asian American here. Thanks, Jon, for inviting me, informing me of this very important forum. Sorry I missed the beginning part of it, coming from Brooklyn. And thank you for composing and making an album on Tiananmen. I'm a survivor of Tiananmen massacre. And thank you for remembering the massacre. It's 33 years ago now. Tiananmen massacre itself, I used to say to international media, it's China's Woodstock. And now I know actually it's more than Woodstock. And Jon corrected me. It's much more than that. It's you know, Woodstock plus March to Washington plus of course summer in Harlem in the 60s. Tiananmen movement actually was a cultural movement. It's a movement of cultural awakening, political awakening of course, but first awakening in music. I always say my first public gig was conducting protest songs in Tiananmen Square. Those protest songs included, main song was actually Internationale, because of the lyrics really spoke to us, and also several generations, including mine, grew up in Internationale, having to listen to it daily. And the national anthem in your album, in your track, that was correctly included and correctly disintegrated and in your own way, in the free jazz way, which was brilliant. I love it. Because the movement was also a patriotic movement. It's not anti-government. Actually, it's pro-government. We're not allowed, and we did not want, me as a leader of my university, when I literally asked people not to say anything against the Chinese Communist Party. We wanted China to be better. We wanted the party to introduce multi-party system, which is an oxymoron, now we know. And the fact the Tiananmen track was just being played now in Colombia is very significant, because even for people who attend anything on Tiananmen 33 years later, poses a risk, especially for the Chinese Americans, Chinese students here on campus. Just before the pandemic, in late 2019, Hong Kong students at Columbia organized a panel discussion called Panopticism in China. Included panelists like me, a Tibetan member of in parliament in exile, and a Uyghur, a very famous Uyghur activist, and another Chinese human rights lawyer. But we were informed at the last minute on the day the event was cancelled because the university, the Columbia University, was concerned about the security. And the information we got was that some Chinese students or some Chinese representatives of the Chinese consulate here threatened to stage protests. We're really shocked. I posted on social media. I drafted a press statement, by the way, I'm also a journalist. So, because then people's reaction was that, wasn't Colombia known for being a hotbed of protests in the 60s, 70s? Has the tradition been lost? So that's another question. a question for everybody here, and especially for you guys. The politics of music. The politics also include the racism, sexism towards the Asian American musicians, which I experienced right at the beginning. I was introduced by the racial blending, the racial mixture of the free jazz, the improv scene is what attracted to me. It was fantastic. It was a white professor who was jamming with black elders, black musicians, introduced me to them, and I was introducing to the whole community. But then again, and I was discriminated against by bandmates who are black and white, especially when they see a little Asian woman, like she's improvising and she has no degree in music, she's never been to a music school, therefore she's not a musician, and I've been called out at concerts saying, oh, you're not a musician, you just hang around musicians. I said, why not? It's not a crime. That's how I learned. I learned through playing.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just conscious of time because we only have about 5 minutes left for this
Okay,
session. Do you have
sorry.
a question that you want to ask to them?
So this is the question, how are we going to address the racism, sexism among the free jazz communities as well, and how the Asian American musicians can really draw from our heritage, because improv is deeply rooted in, at least I know, Chinese culture and Zen Buddhism and Buddhism as a whole. Rather than seeing our Asian heritage as something we really have to dig into, look for instruments or something disadvantages us, why not we take it as something really, which is really cutting edge, which is what improv musicians, avant-garde experimental musicians are looking up to. Thank you.
I wish Glenn was here to speak to the Zen Buddhism and music connection. There were a couple hands over here. Questions? Someone? I think, yeah. No,
Oh, there's somebody in the back.
Oh.
I appreciate this, and I think that we talk about community as if it's one monolithic thing, but I think there are multiple communities. And John, I'm just remembering being at the Studio Museum in Harlem with Dr. Billy Taylor, and his response to your music, and not only his response, but the response of the community there, feeling that there was an allyship they never dreamed of. I wondered if you could share that.
Yeah, it mainly started with the fact that I knew about Paul Robeson. And the first Chinese music I heard was Paul Robeson's '78 recording, Chi Lai, Songs of New China. And it was taking some Chinese folk songs like Feng Yang Hua Gu, the flower drum song, and recontextualizing it within the war of resistance against Japan, China's war of resistance against Japan. And let's see, one of the moving memories I have of that session was that Jabing Chen, who played the erhu, that's the Chinese two-string violin, performed Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen with Dr. Billy Taylor. And that was moving. And Paul Robeson wrote a lot of essays about exploring the kinship between African and Chinese cultures. And he wrote one essay that was about language, because Chinese language and African languages are tonal. And he did comparing Yoruba with Mandarin. So, in fact, there was one black man who was in tears. I remember that. That was a very memorable event for me, as well as, I think, the black community.
I mean, I'm going to ask something else. The moment passed for my other question. Can I sort of close things out? Though, Lauren, you really should. You know, what
I've said my piece. Go for it.
You have done it so nicely. I would love to know from each of you what you see, what you want to see approaching on the horizon. you know, not for yourselves as much as for the entire community of cultural workers involved in these kinds of questions. What do you want to see coming towards us on the horizon at this point? Yeah. I'm asking for a big kind of...
Well,
Big statement.
You're related. You're related to her, right?
Well, we're all related.
Yeah, that's true. We got a lot of people on this planet.
I don't know. It was interesting, right? I rode the plane over, and on the TV, on the seat, they had the Black History Month thing, and they had all these documentary bios, and they had Nikki Giovanni on there, and she was just talking about her relationship with Tupac, and hip hop, and how she. One of the things that she really enjoyed was that folks like that from hip hop looking to her to call on her and draw upon her experiences. And I think that what I would like to see is not see, but to realize is that we're open to being part of the movement going forward. Because at one point, you know, there was just a few of us. You know, and now there are so many Asian Americans engaged in various levels, and I think that more conversations like today, and more like the strategy, you know, like the whole thing about the archives we talked about, and to mentorship, and there are a lot of things that are really involved or that people are kind of scratching the surface on that that we just love to continue to support.
John, anything?
Well, in my childish, immature, looking back at those years, always wanted to kind of, we wanted, a rock band I was in, we wanted to blow people's heads. So so one of the practices is like James Newton and I composed a work. James Newton is a black composer and flutist. We composed a work called When Sorrow Turns to Joy, the spiritual tributary of Paul Robeson and Mei Lan Fong. And Mei Lan Fong was this great Beijing opera artist. He redefined that. He fought for women's rights, women to participate in Beijing opera, because before all the Dan, the women roles were played by men. So when we were at Dartmouth College and we had to give a lecture demonstration or some kind of talk, so instead of the black composer talking about the black man like Paul Robeson, and instead of the ABC, American-born Chinese, talking about Mei Lan Fong, we switched it around so that I talked about Paul Robeson and James Newton, the black composer flutist, talked about Mei Lan Fong. Wednesday night, I performed with black saxophonist Howard Wiley for a Lunar New Year and Black History Month celebration sponsored by the city and the San Francisco Human Rights Organization. So I introduced Lift Every Voice and Sing with its history and how relevant it is today, particularly in Florida, with Governor Ron DeSantis banning the Advanced Placement African Americans Studies course. And then Howard Wiley, black saxophonist, introduced the Butterfly Lover song. It was a good way because he didn't try to sound like Jon Jang. He sounded like Howard Wiley. It was really funny when he said, and if you know the legend, it's about this woman who disguised herself as a man so she could go to school, and then she quickly finds, she meets this young male scholar, and he quickly discovers that she's actually a woman. And the way he presented it, he said, huh? I mean, come on, she's a woman, you know. It put this new kind of like layer of nuance, and I really loved it, enjoyed it. Because I didn't want him to sound like me, I wanted him to sound like him.
I've been told that there's one more question to close this down here, so we're going to get one more.
Yeah, one more, thank you. So I just want to say thank you for being here. Thank you for doing what you do. I'm very touched. I'm grateful. So the Africans and Chinese share the same tonal, yes, it's tonal. And we also share the same words. I speak Igbo, I'm Nigerian. same country that has Yoruba, like you just mentioned. And Igbo language is one of the oldest languages. Some things is the first language. Igbo kind of sounds alike, right? Very old. And she in Chinese means life force. She in Igbo means God. Short form of Shuku, giver of life. And there's other words like that. Sam Chidinma means God is good. So I'm named after that. So I just want to say thank you for being you. Thank you for being authentic. And you don't have to like go oriental or not. I mean, you are you. You're authentic. And we connect to that genuineness of you. We connect to that humanness of you. And for that, I say thank you.
Oh wait, I'm worried. On behalf of Francis, Wong, and me, we would like to thank Professor Kevin Velez, who is also the Director of Jazz Studies here, and Lauren Takakawa, and equally Yolanda McKenzie, who's the Coordinator for Jazz Studies.